In the late summer of 1989, a tragic and mysterious event took place in Siberia, deep in the Soviet Union. 7 teenage boys set out on what seemed to be a simple weekend trip from their hometown of Mezhdorechensk. By the next morning, all of them were dead. Their bodies were found on the railway tracks near a place called Kazynets Station. At first, the authorities quickly explained their deaths as an accident, saying that the boys had fallen asleep on the railway tracks and had been struck by a freight train. This explanation seemed too simple and even unbelievable to many people, especially the families of the boys. Over time, the case became one of those strange Soviet-era mysteries that still raises questions decades later. According to the official version that was announced in August 1989, the 7 boys had gone into the forest near their hometown to spend time together. They were teenagers, full of energy, but also living in a time when there were not many activities or entertainment available in small Siberian towns. Collecting pine cones was one activity that young people sometimes did, either for fun or to sell them later. When their bodies were discovered near the railway, bags of pine cones were found nearby, which supported the idea that they had been gathering them. The Soviet news agency TASS reported that the boys had been lying on the railway tracks. When a freight train approached, the engineer noticed them and sounded a warning signal. But, according to the report, none of the boys moved. The train could not stop in time and ran over them, killing all 7 instantly. The explanation given by investigators was that the boys had simply fallen asleep on the tracks, exhausted after their day in the forest. Because they were asleep, they did not hear the warning, and the tragedy unfolded. At the time, this was the story that the Soviet authorities presented to the public. In newspapers and television broadcasts, the deaths were described as a sad accident, nothing more. In a country where information was tightly controlled, most people had little choice but to accept the official explanation. From the very beginning, however, the families of the boys and some local people felt uneasy about the story. How likely was it that 7 teenage boys would all decide to lie down on the railway tracks at the same time? Even if they were tired, it seemed unusual that they would choose such a dangerous place to rest. Trains were a common sight in Siberia, and children grew up knowing to avoid the tracks. It seemed strange that they would not find a safer place to sleep. Another question was why the boys did not wake up. Even if they were deeply asleep, the noise of a train and the vibration of the tracks are very strong. People familiar with trains pointed out that it is very hard to sleep through such a warning. The fact that all 7 boys remained motionless raised doubts. Some began to wonder if they had truly been asleep, or if something else had prevented them from moving. The positions of the bodies also raised questions. Reports later suggested that they were not lying in neat rows, as one might expect if they had chosen to sleep there. Instead, some were in odd or awkward positions. Unfortunately, detailed photographs or forensic records were not made available to the public, so much of this information comes from second-hand accounts. Still, it fueled suspicion that the accident story was too simple. The investigation into the boys' deaths was short and unsatisfying for many of the families. Officials quickly closed the case, stating that it was clearly an accident. There was little effort to dig deeper or to consider alternative explanations. In the Soviet Union of the 1980s, this was not unusual. Authorities often preferred simple answers, especially if a case could reflect badly on state institutions or raise uncomfortable questions. Families who asked for more information were often ignored. Some said that their requests for the investigative files were refused. Others suspected that important details had been left out of the official reports. Because of this, rumors and alternative theories began to spread. In the absence of clear answers, people searched for their own explanations. One theory was that the boys had been murdered and placed on the tracks afterward to make their deaths look like an accident. If someone wanted to cover up a crime, this would be one way to do it. However, no strong evidence was ever presented to support this idea. Without forensic records or witness statements, it is impossible to know if the boys had injuries that were inconsistent with being struck by a train. Another possibility discussed was that the boys had been drinking alcohol and had passed out on the tracks. This theory is often mentioned in cases involving teenagers, but again, no toxicology reports or medical files were shared publicly. If they had been intoxicated, it might explain why they did not wake up when the train approached. But for all 7 boys to be so deeply unconscious at the same time still seemed strange. Some local people whispered about darker or stranger causes. In Siberia, as in many remote places, folklore and superstition mix with real events. People wondered if there was something unusual about that stretch of railway, or if the boys had encountered something that left them helpless. These ideas remain in the realm of speculation and cannot be proven, but they show how desperate people were to make sense of the tragedy. To understand why the Kazynets Station tragedy remains mysterious, it helps to look at the bigger picture of life in the Soviet Union at the time. The year 1989 was a period of huge change. The country was experiencing political reform under Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Information was beginning to flow more freely, but many institutions still held on to old habits of secrecy and control. Accidents were not rare in the Soviet Union, but officials often tried to downplay or hide them. Admitting to failures could damage reputations or careers. In remote regions like Siberia, where communication with Moscow was limited, local authorities sometimes preferred to settle matters quickly and quietly. This environment made it difficult for ordinary families to demand thorough investigations. Years later, the tragedy was even mentioned in legal and human rights documents. The European Court of Human Rights has records that refer to the incident, particularly in the context of whether the state carried out a proper investigation. The court's focus was not on solving the mystery itself, but on the principle that when people die under unclear circumstances, the state has a duty to investigate fully and transparently. The case of the 7 boys from Mezhdurichensk was an example of when this duty may not have been met. For the families, the lack of answers has been a lifelong wound. They not only lost their children in a sudden and terrible way, but they were also denied the closure that comes from knowing the truth. This double pain, grief combined with uncertainty, is what has kept the memory of the incident alive. Although many details remain uncertain, some facts are clear. 7 teenage boys did leave their homes in Mezhdurichensk in August 1989 for a short trip. Their bodies were indeed found on the railway tracks near Kazynets Station. A train had passed that night, and the boys were struck and killed. Bags of pine cones were found nearby, suggesting they had been gathering them before the tragedy. These points are not in dispute. What is unclear is why the boys were on the tracks, why they did not move when the train approached, and whether the official version of events tells the whole story. The lack of detailed investigation means that these questions may never be answered with certainty. Part of the reason this case still captures attention is the sheer unlikeliness of the official story. It is difficult to imagine 7 teenagers all deciding to sleep on railway tracks and all failing to wake up when danger approached. Human instincts and common sense suggest that something else may have happened. This gap between the official explanation and ordinary people's understanding of human behavior is what gives rise to mystery. The passage of time also adds to the sense of puzzle. More than 30 years have gone by since that summer morning in 1989. Witnesses may no longer be alive, and physical evidence has long since been lost. Even if new efforts were made to investigate, the trail is cold. This means that speculation will probably continue, as people try to fill in the blanks with their own theories. Although not as famous as the Dyatlov Pass incident, which happened in the Ural Mountains in 1959, the Kazynets Station tragedy is sometimes compared to it. Both involve young people who died mysteriously in the wilderness of the Soviet Union. Both cases highlight how fragile human life can be in harsh and isolated environments. And both reveal the difficulties of uncovering truth in a system where secrecy often outweighed openness. For the families of the 7 boys, the tragedy is personal and painful. For historians and observers, it is a reminder of how incomplete records and unanswered questions can turn a sad accident into a lasting mystery. For society at large, it is a lesson about the importance of transparent and careful investigations, especially when lives are lost. The deaths of the 7 teenage boys near Kazynets Station in August 1989 remain one of those stories that seem too strange to be fully believed, yet too real to be ignored. The official version says they fell asleep on the railway tracks and were killed by a freight train. But many people, including their families, have always doubted this explanation. The lack of a thorough investigation and the absence of clear evidence have left room for endless speculation. What happened on that night may never be fully known. The boys' last hours remain hidden in the darkness of history, covered by official silence and the passing of time. What is certain, however, is the tragedy of 7 young lives cut short, and the enduring sorrow of their families. The Kazynets Station tragedy reminds us how important it is to ask questions, to demand truth, and to honor the memory of those who can no longer speak for themselves.